Welcome to this tutorial on how to interact with Azure Blob Storage using the Node.js Blob Storage client library. In this tutorial, we'll be making an app service web app, which will be based on a Node.js web app using the Express.js library, where we will create an API where we can interact with an Azure Blob Storage account. So let's get started now. First, what we'll need to do is create some Azure resources using the Azure command line interface. So we'll need to create the Azure resource group and the Azure storage account. So let's do that now. First, you need to log in. Once you've done that, you can create the resource group using AZ group create. After that, you can create the storage account using AZ storage account create. Okay, so that's been created. You want to have access to this reference material here, which is the Azure SDK for JavaScript, and it's got a section here on storage and storage blobs. So this is all the documentation to do with the Azure Blob Storage library for Node.js, so make sure you got access to that. I've included it as a link in the blog post as well, which will be linked in the YouTube description. Okay, so what we'll do is initialize a brand new Node.js project and start creating the project. So let's do that now. Okay, so I've got an empty directory here, and I'll start by initializing it with npm init. Enter the defaults in here just to get the project created. Okay, so we've got a package JSON that's been created. So next what we'll do is install the dependencies that we need. So the dependencies that we need are 4 dependencies. We need Express, we need .env for reading .env files, and we need the 2 Azure dependencies, Azure Storage Blob and Azure Identity. Now we want to update package.json so that we can use the start command to run our project. So just use this start node index.js in your package.json file under the scripts. That's really all you need to change. Okay, so when we test this locally, we'll be using a .env file, which will have reference to the storage account name that we created earlier. So we can create that now. So within the directory, the project directory you're currently in, you just need to put it in the root of that directory. So it's just called .env. And then you can just copy this over from the blog post. The environment variable will be Azure storage account name, and you just set that name as what you created above. Okay, so now for the main part of this tutorial, which will be our index.js file, which will contain all the code relating to the Express API and how it interacts with the Node.js Blob Storage client library. So we'll create that now, and I'll just copy all the code over there from that blog post so you can see how it works. Now, in addition to this index.js file, you'll also need to create a util.js file, so we'll do that right now. It just has one utility in it. So the utility is called stream to text, and it's used when we download the blob. So just add that stream to text function into the util.js file. You can copy that over from the blog post as well. Before I go over the code, I'll just run it now using an npm start. You can see some output that the app is listening on port 8080. Now, if we review the code for this now, what we're doing is, first, we're getting the blob service client using the constructor blob service client, and we're using a URL where we're getting the storage account name from the environment variable, and then we're appending .blob.core.windows.net, which is the URL path to that storage account. Along with that, we're using the default Azure credential. And in the case when I'm running this locally, it's using the credential associated with AZ login. And that's what it's using to get access to that storage account. So it's got access to the storage account, and it's using the name provided, which is the container name, in the JSON body. And we're using the method getContainerClient and passing the name of the container to get a hold of that container within the blob storage account. Now, the container doesn't exist, So we need to create that container. So we need to invoke the create method on the container client for that to take place. And if that's successful, it will return a request ID, a date, and an e-tag. And in the sunny day scenario that works all fine, we'll be sending those attributes back in the response with a 200 OK code using the res.send. But if there's any errors at all with this, it's going to be caught and it's going to send a 500 status code and mention that it's been unable to create the container. So we've got the /containers route next on the Express API. And this is what we use for listing all the containers within a storage account. Now, it uses the same blob service client we defined at the start of the API. And it's invoking the list containers command to get a list of all the container names. And that runs asynchronously, and it will go through each container from that list containers command and access the name of that container and add that to an array. And that array will contain a list of objects. And that object just has one key, which is the name, that it will return back in the response to the API. If it's unable to do that, it will just send a status code of 500 with a message saying it's unable to list the containers. The next part of the API will be for uploading a blob to a container. And this will be via a post request using the path containers / the container name / blobs. And in the request body, we'll take the name of the blob and what text we want to put into that blob. And in the request parameters, we'll take the container name. And we'll use the container client by using the blob service client and using the get container client method, passing the name of the container. From there, we'll create the block blob client using the container client and using the get block blob client method, passing the name of the blob. And from there, we'll define some upload blob options. Now, the files that we'll be uploading as blobs will be text files. So we'll use the content type, which will be set as a header. And we'll set that to text plain. And we'll also provide some metadata, which will contain a key of source and a value of that key being the app name, which is custom Node.js Express Blobs API. So that will be visible as metadata against that blob when we check it in the storage account. We'll invoke the upload function on the block blob client, and this is asynchronous, and we need to pass the text that we want to upload into the blob, the length of that text, and the various blob options that we defined, the upload blob options. We'll wait for that to be processed, and then we'll get back some parameters on the response, the request ID, date, and e-tag, and we'll send that in the response back as a successful response. If there's any issue, we'll send a status code of 500 and send an error message saying it's unable to upload the blob to the container. The next part of it is listing all blobs in a container, and this will be a GET request, and the path will contain containers / the name of the container name / blobs. And we're just going to get all the blobs within that container. So we'll use the container name and get that from the request parameters and use the blob service client, and using the get container client function, we'll invoke that using the container name that we've got. And then we'll put together a list of all the blobs, and we'll use the list blobs flat function on the container client to get a list of all blobs on that container client. Get the name of that blob and the URL of that blob, provide that back as an array of blobs in the response. And we'll raise an error if we can't get that for whatever reason. Next, we'll have an API route for downloading a blob and getting its contents. So to do this, we'll use a path /containers / container name / blobs / blob name. And we'll get the container name and blob name from the request parameters. Then we'll create a container client and a block blob client like we did before, passing the container name and the blob name. And we're using the download method to download the contents of that blob, and there will be no offset, so we've set that to 0 as a parameter on the download function. And we're going to wait and use the stream to text function to load that data into the variable data. And then we'll send all of that data in the response back to the user. That data is basically just the text that's inside that blob. Then we've got an API route to delete a blob. And the path will be containers, the container name /blobs / the blob name. And we'll be gathering the container name and blob name off the request parameters. We'll create the container client from the blob service client. And we'll also get the block blob client as well. Then we'll use the delete function on the block blob client. And if that's successful, we'll get a request ID from that. And we'll provide that along with the blob name in the response back to the user if it was successfully deleted. Next, we'll create a path for deleting a container. So this is using the delete method, providing the path name /containers / the name of the container. And the main difference here is we're using the container client and we're invoking the delete function on the container client. And if it's successful, we'll get the request ID and then we'll send that in a response with the container name back to the user. So we'll have a bit of a play with the app now locally first. So we'll start by getting a list of all the containers in a storage account. So I'm just using the curl command and I'm specifying the host, which is localhost on port 8080. And the path is just /containers. And at the moment, there's no containers in there. So let's create our first container. We'll give it the name container ABC. So we're making a post request, giving the name of the container. So you'll notice we've hit an error here, and this is because we haven't gotten the storage blob data contributor role assigned to our user that we're using via the AZ login command. So we need to do that now. This is a default credential that will be used when we run this locally. So what we need to do is use the AZ role assignment create command and assign the role storage blob data contributor to our current user. So we'll do that right now. It can take up to 10 minutes for the permissions to be updated. So we'll wait for that to complete, then we'll try this again. If you have a look in the Azure Portal, if you go into My Permissions, you should see you have access to the role storage blob data contributor for your storage account. So you'll need that to be able to upload files to your blob storage account within a container. So we've waited a bit for it now. So let's try and upload a blob to a container. Okay, and that has come back as successful. So now we'll list all the blobs within the container. And we've got that blob txt showing there in an array of blobs. Now we'll try and get the blob contents. So we're making a GET request here. And we've gotten the text from the blob.txt file, which is provided as a response with the data parameter as hello world. So now we'll try and delete a blob. And we need to give a HTTP delete request for this. And it looks like that has been successful. So if we try and list all the blobs in that container again, we should see that there's nothing left within that container. So there's an empty container. Finally, we'll try and delete that container with a HTTP delete request. Okay, looks like that's been successful. So now we'll list all the containers and we should see none come back now. Okay, so the API works as expected locally. So let's deploy this as a app service web app and try to get it working on the Azure side. But now we'll create the app service plan using an AZ app service plan create command. Okay, so that is successful. Now what we want to do is deploy the web app and we'll use an AZ web app up command for this. This is inside the directory that's got our project in it. Okay, so it looks like that's deployed now. So what we want to do next is configure some app settings that are going to be the environment variables. So one of the environment variables we need to set is Azure storage account name. So we're going to set that using the AZ web app config app settings set command, specifying a resource group, the name of the app service web app, and the settings flag along with the environment variable, Azure storage account name, and the name of our storage account. Okay, so next what we need to do is create another environment variable for website's port. This is for forwarding the traffic to port 8080 where the Express server is listening on. So these changes won't take effect until we restart, but before we do that, I need to create a system assigned managed identity for the app service web app to give it access to the storage blob data contributor role on the storage account. So previously we gave access to that role, the storage blob data contributor role, to an individual user. So Now we're going to be creating a managed identity for the web app and assigning the role to the web app itself. So a bit of a different way to do it. So to do that, we need to use AZ Web App Identity Assign, provide the resource group name and the name of the web app. And from there, we're going to get some information back that we'll need to use in the next command for creating the role. So we've got the principal ID and we need that in our next command. So I'm just going to copy that. What we're going to do now is we're going to use that principal ID we just created and we're going to call AZ role assignment create and assign to that service principal the role storage blob data contributor and give it the scope of our subscription, the resource group, and the storage account. And this is what our web app will use for interacting with our storage account. So that's been successful. So finally, for all these changes to take effect into our web app, we'll restart it using our AZ web app restart command, specifying the name of the web app and the resource group. We'll go into the Azure portal now and refresh the resource group. And you can see we've got an app service plan, we've got a storage account and an app service in there. So we'll go into the app service web app. Okay, so we've got this default domain. So let's open that now. So what we're seeing is hello from custom Node.js Express blobs API, which is what we expect. Now we'll run some curl commands against this domain. And hopefully it will actually create the blobs behind the scene. Now, there are some security risks with this. You don't want to run something like this in production because technically the API is exposed to everyone. Everyone can create blobs into your storage bucket, so that can run up some large costs for you. So this is just to demonstrate what you can do with the client library. So that's really the intent of this tutorial, not to use it in production as an application. So we'll get started with some kill commands. Let's start by creating a container and a storage account using a post request and passing the container name of container ABC. Okay, so we've got a 200 to that. Next, we'll list all the containers in the storage account. We should just have that one we just created. Yep, we can see that container ABC. Next, we'll upload a blob to that container by specifying the text we want in that blob. So this is using a post request and providing the name of the blob.text and the text in the blob to be hello world. And we're going to put that into the container ABC, and that's successful. Next, we'll download the blob's contents and return that as a string in the response. Yep, we can see the data hello world. Next, we'll delete this blob out of the container. This will be achieved by using a delete HTTP request. Okay, so then we can verify it's been deleted by listing the blobs within that container again. So we have no blobs now. And now we'll delete this container with another HTTP delete request. Okay, we've got a request ID there, so that indicates that it's been successful. So if we list all the containers in that storage account now, we should have an empty array. Really, that's it for this tutorial. We can clean up the resources, which will delete everything we've created under that resource group, including the storage accounts, the web app, and the app service plan. That's it for this tutorial. If you found it useful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.